The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I parked my RV at the edge of the dense forest that lined the shore of Blackwood River. I'd been coming here for years, ever since I was a kid, tagging along with my old man on his fishing trips. Back then, it was about the thrill of catching the biggest bass. Now, as a 34-year-old accountant from Wilmington, I just needed a place to clear my head, away from the mind-numbing spreadsheets and corporate double talk. This river was my escape, a piece of tranquility that hadn't changed since I first cast a line into its dark waters. My name's Brock Jensen. Folks usually say I'm an easygoing guy, quick with a joke but not the kind to back down when pushed. My life? Well, it's pretty ordinary. Work's good enough. I've got a small place in the city and I'm single, though not for lack of trying. The dating scene isn't exactly kind to a guy who'd rather spend his weekends alone in the woods. I'm okay with that. I'd take the silence of these trees over awkward small talk any day. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between casting lines, I wonder if there's something more out there for me. Someone who might understand why I need these escapes. Why the sound of leaves rustling in the wind feels more like home than any four walls ever could. As I stepped out of the RV, the crunch of gravel under my boots brought back a flood of memories. I could almost hear my dad's laughter echoing across the water, see his weathered hands working the fishing line with practiced ease. He'd been gone for 5 years now, taken too soon by a heart attack that no one saw coming. These trips to Blackwood River were my way of keeping his memory alive, of holding on to the lessons he'd taught me about patience, about finding peace in solitude. Setting up camp was a breeze. I've got it down to a science by now. Unfold the awning, set out the chairs, crack open a beer, and let the stress of the week dissolve into the calm ripple of the river. The weather was cool, a slight breeze brushing through the leaves, and the sun was just dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the water. It was perfect. As I sat there watching the last rays of sunlight dance across the river's surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to linger a little longer, or how the usual chorus of forest sounds seemed muted, as if the woods were holding their breath. I brushed it off as paranoia, a side effect of too many late nights poring over financial reports. The first night was uneventful. I grilled some steaks over the fire, watched the stars come out, and drifted off to sleep with the gentle murmur of the river in my ears. But my dreams were restless, filled with shapeless forms that slithered just out of sight, always on the periphery of my vision. I woke early the next morning, eager to shake off the unease that had followed me into sleep. The fish were biting, and by noon, I had a couple of good-sized trout chilling in the cooler. It was the kind of day that reminded me why I loved this place. Simple, peaceful, and undisturbed. As the day wore on, I decided to explore a bit. There was an old trail I hadn't walked in years, one that wound deeper into the woods, far from the riverbank. The locals used to tell stories about this part of the forest, tales of strange lights and eerie sounds that would send a chill down your spine. I never bought into that stuff. Ghost stories are for kids, right? But as I set off down the overgrown path, pushing through thick underbrush, I couldn't help but recall some of those old legends. There was one about a logging camp that disappeared overnight back in the 1930s, every man vanishing without a trace. Another spoke of Native American tribes that refused to set foot in these woods, calling them cursed ground. I shook my head, trying to dispel the creeping unease. I was a grown man, for Christ's sake, not some superstitious kid huddled around a campfire. Still, I couldn't ignore the way the forest seemed to close in around me, the canopy overhead growing denser with each step, blocking out more and more of the afternoon sun. The usual sounds, birds, squirrels, the rustling of leaves, seemed to fade, replaced by an unnerving stillness. I paused for a moment, listening, but heard nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. ignoring the fact that I couldn't feel even the slightest breeze against my skin. After about an hour, I reached a clearing I didn't recognize. It was small, circular, with a large flat stone at the center. The stone was strange, too smooth, too perfectly round to be natural. I approached it cautiously, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence of the clearing. As I got closer, I noticed odd markings etched into the stone's surface. They weren't like any language I'd ever seen, more like abstract symbols or pictographs. Some looked like twisted versions of animals, others like stars or celestial bodies. But there was one that stood out, repeated several times around the edge of the stone, a shape that looked unsettlingly like a human figure, but wrong somehow, its limbs too long and bent at impossible angles. I ran my hand over the symbols, tracing their outlines with my fingers. As I did, I felt a faint vibration, like something humming beneath the surface. The stone was cool to the touch, unnaturally so given the warmth of the day. I stepped back, suddenly uneasy. I'd been in these woods hundreds of times, but I'd never seen anything like this. A twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind me, and I whirled around, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just the dense wall of trees surrounding the clearing. But I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape darting between the trunks. Shrugging off the weird vibe, I decided it was time to head back. The sun was beginning to set, and I didn't want to get caught out here in the dark. I retraced my steps, but the way back seemed longer, the trees denser. The shadows stretched further, twisting the familiar path into something unrecognizable. I quickened my pace, but the sense of unease grew with every step. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder than the crunch of leaves underfoot. The forest seemed to be closing in around me, branches reaching out like grasping fingers, roots rising up to trip my feet. Just when I thought I might be lost, might have to spend the night in these increasingly menacing woods, I caught a glimpse of water through the trees. Relief washed over me as I pushed through the last of the undergrowth and found myself back at the riverbank, my campsite just a short distance away. But as I approached, I noticed something strange. The fire I'd left smoldering was out, not just dead, but buried under a mound of dirt and rocks. I hadn't done that. I never would have. My first instinct was to laugh it off, maybe a prankster or some animal. But there was no one around and no signs of tracks. Just the fire, smothered as if someone, or something, had wanted to erase all evidence of human presence. Feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, I walked to the edge of the river and splashed some water on my face. The cool liquid helped clear my head, but as I straightened up, wiping water from my eyes, I saw it. A large, dark shape gliding just beneath the surface. At first I thought it was a log, but it moved too smoothly, too deliberately. I watched, frozen as it circled near the shore before disappearing into the deeper water. I knew this river well, and there was nothing in it that size, at least nothing that should be moving like that. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease. It had been a long day, and I was probably just seeing things. The fading light playing tricks on my eyes, turning harmless river debris into imaginary monsters. Still, I kept my eyes on the water as I walked back to the RV, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle with every step. The night came quickly, the darkness pressing in around the campsite. I locked the RV doors, a habit I'd never bothered with before, and settled into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept drifting back to the clearing, to that stone with its bizarre symbols, and to the dark shape in the water. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't shake. The forest I'd known and loved for years suddenly felt alien, hostile. Every creak of the RV in the wind, every rustle from the trees outside set my nerves on edge. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd let those old ghost stories get to me, but deep down, I knew this was different. This wasn't the product of an overactive imagination or campfire tales. There was something out there, something that didn't want me here. As I lay there staring at the ceiling of the RV, I made a decision. First thing in the morning, I'd pack up and head home. Whatever was going on in these woods, I wanted no part of it. But as the old saying goes, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And in the depths of Blackwood Forest, something was stirring. Something that had no intention of letting me leave so easily. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud against the side of the RV. I shot up, heart racing, and listened. Another thud, this time accompanied by a scraping sound, like claws dragging across metal. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and flicked it on, shining it toward the windows. Nothing. Just the stillness of the night outside. The thudding grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't coming from the sides. It was coming from above. Something was on the roof. I bolted upright, grabbing the closest thing I had for a weapon, a tire iron from the compartment under the bed. The sound moved across the roof, heavy and deliberate, like something was crawling, testing the weight of the vehicle. My hands were slick with sweat as I edged toward the door, the tire iron held tight in my white-knuckled grip. I had no idea what I was about to face, but I knew I couldn't stay inside, trapped like a rat in a cage. With a deep breath, I flung the door open and leaped outside, shining the flashlight up at the roof. What I saw defied all reason, all logic. It was a creature straight out of a nightmare, something that should not, could not exist in our world. The thing was massive, its body a grotesque fusion of scales and fur, like some nightmarish hybrid of a crocodile and a wild boar. Its limbs were too long, too jointed, bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Wicked claws, easily the length of my forearm, dug into the metal of the RV's roof, leaving deep gouges in their wake. But it was the creature's face that truly paralyzed me with fear. Its head was elongated, almost canine in shape, but hairless and covered in a patchwork of scales and raw, pulsating flesh. Multiple eyes, glowing with an otherworldly intelligence, were scattered across its face in no discernible pattern. And its mouth, dear God, its mouth, was a gaping maw lined with row upon row of jagged teeth, dripping with a viscous black fluid that sizzled when it hit the ground. The thing let out a low, rumbling noise, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my bones and set my teeth on edge. It turned its grotesque head toward me, those unnatural eyes locking onto mine, and I knew then that this was no ordinary animal, no bear or wolf or anything that should exist in these woods. This was something else entirely, something ancient and malevolent. I stood there, frozen in terror, nearly dropping the flashlight as the creature regarded me with what I could only describe as cruel curiosity. Then, without warning, it leaped from the roof, landing with a sickening thud just feet from where I stood. The ground shook with the impact and I stumbled backward, my survival instincts finally kicking in. The creature lunged at me, faster than I could react, knocking me to the ground. I felt its claws tear into my side, a burning pain that shot through my entire body. I screamed, thrashing wildly, and managed to land a lucky blow with the tire iron against its head. The creature recoiled, shaking its massive form, and I took the opportunity to scramble to my feet. Adrenaline surged through me as I ran toward the riverbank, my side screaming in pain with every step. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, snarling and howling like nothing I'd ever heard before. The sound was a mixture of rage and hunger, primal and terrifying. I made it to the river, my lungs burning, blood soaking through my shirt, and without thinking I plunged into the icy water. The current was strong, stronger than I remembered, but I let it carry me downstream, away from whatever that thing was. I swam until my arms gave out, until I couldn't hear the sounds of the forest anymore, just the rush of the river. Finally, I pulled myself onto the shore, gasping for breath, my body shaking from cold and fear. I didn't know how far I'd gone, but I knew I couldn't stay here. The creature could still be out there, hunting me. I crawled to a nearby tree, using it to pull myself up, and started limping through the woods, desperate to find some sign of civilization. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but nothing fit. There was no logic, no reason for that thing to exist. Was it some kind of mutant, the result of a government experiment gone wrong? Or was it something older, something that had always been here, hiding in the depths of the forest, emerging only to feed on unfortunate souls who wandered too far from safety? After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a road, deserted and silent in the pre-dawn light. I collapsed on the asphalt, too exhausted to move, but not before I saw headlights approaching in the distance. I waved my arms weakly, praying it wasn't some hallucination, and to my relief, the car stopped. A man got out, his face pale with shock as he saw the state I was in. He asked if I was okay, but all I could do was mutter something about a creature, a monster in the woods. He didn't seem to believe me, not really, but he helped me into the car and sped off toward the nearest town. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital rooms and police interviews. They patched up my wounds, but the doctors seemed baffled by the nature of the injuries. The claw marks were unlike anything they'd seen before, and the wounds resisted normal treatment, refusing to close properly. The police went back to the campsite. They found the RV, torn apart just as I'd described, and the stone in the clearing with its bizarre symbols. But there was no sign of the creature. No tracks, no fur or scales. Nothing to prove that what I'd seen was real. Some of the officers believed me, though. How could they not, with the blood and claw marks that were all too real? But others, I could tell, thought I was crazy, that I'd had some kind of mental break, hurt myself, and conjured up a monster to explain it all. I never went back to Blackwood River. Whatever that thing was, it was real, and it was still out there, somewhere in those woods. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear its howl, still feel the weight of its body as it pinned me to the ground. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I'll see its twisted form looming over my bed, those unnatural eyes gleaming in the darkness. But that's all there is to say, really. I'm alive, and that's what matters. I've tried to move on, to forget about what happened in those woods. But I know the truth now. I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our reality, and I can never unknow that. For months after the incident, I struggled to return to normal life. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, plagued as I was by nightmares of gnashing teeth and glowing eyes. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound sent my heart racing. I threw myself into my work, hoping that the monotony of numbers and spreadsheets would drown out the memories of that night. But the scars remained, both physical and mental. The claw marks on my side refused to heal properly, leaving angry red welts that ached in cold weather. Doctors were baffled, running test after test, but finding no explanation for why the wounds wouldn't close. In the end, they chalked it up to some unknown infection and prescribed a cocktail of antibiotics that did little to help. I became obsessed with finding answers. Late at night, when sleep eluded me, I'd scour the internet for any information I could find about Blackwood River and its surrounding forest. Most of what I found was typical tourist information or fishing guides, but occasionally, buried deep in obscure forums or local history sites, I'd catch glimpses of stories that echoed my own. There were tales of missing hikers, of strange lights seen deep in the woods, of eerie sounds that couldn't be explained away as wildlife. One account, posted anonymously on a paranormal investigation website, described a creature disturbingly similar to what I'd encountered. The post was quickly deleted, but not before I'd saved a copy, proof that I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. As the months turned into years, I found myself drawn back to Blackwood River. Not physically, but mentally. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would make sense of it all. The smooth stone with its bizarre symbols haunted my thoughts. What was it? Who had put it there? And what connection did it have to the creature? It was during one of my late-night research sessions, almost 3 years after my encounter, that I stumbled upon a name that would change everything. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a professor of anthropology at a nearby university. She had published several papers on the folklore and legends of the Blackwood River area, including one that mentioned the Starstone, a mysterious artifact said to have been worshipped by ancient tribes in the region. With trembling hands, I emailed Dr. Vance, expecting yet another dead end. To my surprise, she responded within hours, expressing keen interest in my story. We arranged to meet at a small cafe in Wilmington, far from the shadows of Blackwood Forest. Dr. Vance was not what I expected. She was a small, wiry woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. As I recounted my experience, she listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes in a worn leather journal. When I finished, she sat back, a grave expression on her face. "Mr. Jensen," she said, her voice low, "what you encountered that night was something my colleagues and I have been studying for years. We believe it to be a guardian, a protector of sorts, tied to the land itself." She went on to explain that the stone I'd found was indeed the Starstone of legend, an ancient artifact of immense power. According to her research, it served as a gateway between our world and somewhere else. The creature I'd seen was likely drawn to the stone's energy, emerging to defend it against perceived threats. "But why me?" I asked, my voice cracking. I wasn't trying to harm anything. I was just camping, like I'd done 100 times before. Dr. Vance shook her head. "Intent doesn't matter to these beings, Mr. Jensen. Your presence alone, especially your touch on the stone, would have been enough to trigger a response. You're lucky to have escaped with your life." As we talked, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. Here, finally, was someone who believed me, who could offer some explanation for the inexplicable. Dr. Vance shared more of her research, painting a picture of a hidden world existing alongside our own, filled with forces and beings beyond our comprehension. In the weeks that followed, I found myself working closely with Dr. Vance and her team. My experience, combined with my financial background, proved valuable in securing funding for their research. We never returned to the exact spot of my encounter. The risks were too great. But we explored other areas of the forest, gathering data and piecing together the puzzle of Blackwood River's secrets. Slowly, I began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the paranoia less acute. Understanding, even if it was just a fraction of the truth, brought a measure of peace. I still bear the scars of that night, both physical and emotional, but they no longer define me. Today, 5 years after my encounter, I lead a different life. I left my accounting job, using my skills instead to manage the finances of Dr. Vance's research foundation. We've made remarkable progress in understanding the phenomena surrounding Blackwood River, though we've only scratched the surface of what's really out there. I still camp, believe it or not. Not at Blackwood River, never there again, but in other forests, other wild places. I've learned to appreciate the beauty of nature again, while always maintaining a healthy respect for its mysteries. Every time I sit by a campfire, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, I'm reminded of how little we truly know about the world around us. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the fire has burned low and the forest grows still, I think I can hear something moving in the darkness beyond the light. A part of me tenses, ready to run, to fight. But another part, the part that's grown and changed since that night by Blackwood River, simply acknowledges it. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. They were here long before us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. All we can do is respect their existence, protect the wild places they call home, and hope that in doing so, we can find a way to coexist in this vast, mysterious universe we all share. As for the thing in Blackwood River, it's still out there, I'm sure of it, waiting, watching, guarding secrets we may never fully comprehend. And in a strange way, I'm okay with that. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved. If there's one thing I've learned after 7 years working as a park ranger in the Chiricahua National Monument, it's that nothing truly surprises me anymore. At least, that's what I thought until that fateful night in October 2019. My name's Connor Bissell, and I'm about to tell you a story that'll make you question everything you think you know about the natural world. I grew up in Yuma, Arizona, a desert kid through and through. When I first got assigned to Chiricahua, I didn't expect to fall in love with the forest, but there was something about this place that got under my skin. It's not like other parks. It's quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It's like the land itself is just holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Over the years, I've had my fair share of close calls with nature, rattlesnakes mostly. We've had bears and bobcats, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. That's why when 2 hikers stumbled into the ranger station back in early 2019, babbling about something stalking them through the dense forests, I chalked it up to paranoia. They swore it was bigger than a mountain lion, moved faster than anything they'd ever seen. I listened, nodded, and filed the report away without giving it much thought. Little did I know those hikers were just the beginning. It was a crisp autumn night when everything changed. I was working a late patrol, probably one of the last ones before I'd pack it in for the night. Our shifts can run long when there's no one else around, and I don't mind the quiet. The radio was dead, and the night was just like it always was, pitch black, with a sky full of stars that felt way too close. I don't like using the flashlight much. It's too bright, ruins the peace. So I was walking in the dark, trusting my eyes to adjust as they always did. The trail I was on runs parallel to a stretch of deep woods, and that's when I first caught a glimpse of something moving through the trees. At first, I didn't think much of it. Wildlife is active at night, and I've seen plenty of nocturnal creatures going about their business. But as I continued down the trail, I noticed something off about the movement. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow either, just a hulking shape shifting between the trunks, keeping pace with me. My first thought was that it must be a black bear. Bears can get big out here, especially if they're feeding well before hibernation. But then it stopped. Dead still. Now animals don't just stop moving without reason. Not like that. I stood still for a moment, scanning the shadows with my flashlight. My beam caught a flash of something pale, and that's when I realized this wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It stepped into the clearing, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The creature was tall, probably a good 7 or 8 feet. Its legs were long and gangly with joints that seemed wrong, like they didn't quite bend the way a mammal's should. But what really got me was its skin. It wasn't fur. It wasn't anything natural looking. It was smooth, almost like sickly pale leather, stretched tight over its bones. I stood there frozen, trying to figure out what kind of animal I was dealing with. I've seen mountain lions, elk, all manner of creatures, but nothing like this. Its face had a snout, long and narrow, but not like a dog or a wolf. More like a crocodile, but without the scales. Its mouth was open, hanging slightly as if it was smelling the air, and inside there were rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Teeth that didn't belong in any animal I'd ever read about. I reached for my radio, but then the thing moved. It didn't charge, didn't make a sound. It just walked, slow and deliberate, toward the trees again, disappearing into the darkness as silently as it had come. I stood there, staring at the spot where it vanished, my heart hammering. That thing had been close enough to me that I could hear its labored breathing, almost like it was struggling to stay alive. I wasn't about to chase it into the woods. I mean, come on, I may be a park ranger, but I'm not suicidal. Instead, I kept walking down the trail, eyes darting left and right, trying to make sense of what I saw. The forest was dead silent after that. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even a single chirp from a cricket. That's when I knew something was wrong. Animals don't just vanish like that. They scatter, they hide. But this was something else. A good hour went by before I saw anything unusual again. By that point, I had almost convinced myself that I'd been seeing things. Maybe a trick of the light, I thought. Maybe a weird shadow. But deep down, I knew better. I've spent years in these woods. I know every rock, every tree, every sound that comes with the night. As I continued my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I found myself jumping at every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves. The forest, which had always been my home away from home, suddenly felt alien and hostile. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was some kind of escaped exotic pet, I thought, or a bear with mange. But even as I considered these possibilities, I knew they didn't fit. What I'd seen was something entirely different, something that shouldn't exist in our world. As the hours ticked by, I found myself circling back to the area where I'd first spotted the creature. Part of me hoped I'd find some evidence. Tracks, fur, anything that could prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy. But the forest floor was undisturbed, showing no signs of the massive being that had passed through earlier. Just as I was about to call it a night and head back to the ranger station, I saw it again. This time it was closer, standing on the ridge just ahead of me. Its silhouette was impossible to mistake, especially with the moonlight behind it. I froze. This time I noticed something else. It wasn't alone. There were two of them. The second one was smaller, thinner, but equally twisted, with the same long limbs and pale, leathery skin. They stood together, motionless, watching me. I could feel their presence like a weight pressing on my chest. But I couldn't move. I didn't want to show fear. Hell, I didn't know what else to do. Standing still didn't feel any better. One of them let out a low, rasping breath. It wasn't quite a sound, more like air moving through dry leaves. My hand instinctively reached for the knife strapped to my belt. I wasn't armed with a gun. Not that it would have made much difference against whatever these things were. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a scream, a human scream, from deep within the woods. It was sharp, cut short, and unmistakably a man's voice. I don't know if it was the adrenaline or instinct, but I bolted toward the sound. Running through those woods in the dark is about the worst thing you can do, but I couldn't just stand there. I had to know. The scream led me to a small clearing, but when I got there it was already too late. A man, middle-aged by the look of him, lay face down in the dirt, unmoving. His body was torn open in places that I don't care to describe in detail. Let's just say it was brutal and leave it at that. But those things, they were gone. I radioed it in, calling for backup. Of course, it took forever for anyone to get there. By the time they did, I had already searched the area, but there was no sign of the creatures, not a trace. When my colleagues arrived, I tried to explain what I'd seen, but you can imagine how that went. Blank stares, questions that danced around the fact that they didn't believe a word I was saying. But the man's body was there, lying in a pool of his own blood. That part was real enough. They chalked it up to an animal attack, a mountain lion maybe. The local authorities took over, said they'd handle the investigation. I wasn't going to argue. What was I supposed to say? That two gangly, crocodile-faced creatures from some nightmare had been stalking me through the woods and killed a man? No one would believe that. The official report said it was a big cat, but I know what I saw. I didn't go back to that section of the park for a while, couldn't bring myself to. But curiosity has a way of pulling you back in. About a month later, I ventured into the same area. Not because I wanted to see those things again, but because part of me needed closure. Closure I didn't think I'd get. That's when I found it. A bone, half buried in the dirt near where the man had died. It wasn't human. Too long, too thin, and the end was snapped like it had been chewed on. I stood there for a long while, staring at it, not sure what to make of it. But I didn't touch it. Didn't want to. I left it where it lay, turned and walked back down the trail. Whatever those things were, they were still out there. I couldn't prove it, not in a way anyone else would believe. But I didn't need to. They knew, and so did I. In the weeks that followed, I found myself questioning everything. Every shadow in the forest seemed to hide one of those creatures. Every unexpected sound made me jump. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of the job had finally gotten to me. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the reports started coming in. Hikers claiming to have seen strange, pale figures moving through the trees at dusk. Campers waking up to find their sites ransacked, with no signs of bears or other wildlife. And always that eerie silence that seemed to follow in the wake of these sightings. I started keeping a log, documenting every incident, every detail I could gather. I knew I was onto something, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in way over my head. Despite my better judgment, I began spending more time in the area where I'd first encountered the creatures. I set up trail cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of them on film. Night after night, I'd return to check the footage, only to find nothing but the usual forest animals. But then one evening, I hit pay dirt. The camera had captured something moving through the frame, just at the edge of its range. The image was blurry, indistinct, but there was no mistaking that elongated silhouette, those unnaturally long limbs. I took the footage to my supervisor, hoping that this would be the evidence I needed to prove I wasn't crazy. But as we reviewed the video together, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He suggested it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe just a trick of the light. I knew then that I was on my own. If I wanted answers, I'd have to find them myself. It was a cold November night when everything came to a head. I was on my usual patrol, skirting the edge of the area where I'd had my encounters. The air was thick with fog, limiting visibility to just a few feet in front of me. That's when I heard it, that same rasping breath I'd heard before. But this time, it was coming from behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, and found myself face to face with one of the creatures. It was even more terrifying up close. Its eyes were milky white with no pupils that I could see. Its skin seemed to pulse and shift in the beam of my flashlight as if it couldn't quite hold its shape. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my radio. But before I could call for help, the creature spoke. Its voice was like gravel being ground together, barely recognizable as language. But I understood it all the same. "We've been waiting for you, Connor," it said. And that's when I realized the truth. These weren't some unknown species of animal. They weren't from our world at all. They were something else entirely, something that had been watching us, studying us, for who knows how long. As more of them emerged from the fog surrounding me, I knew that my life as I knew it was over. The Chiricahua National Monument wasn't just a park, it was a gateway, and I had just stumbled through it. I'm writing this down now, in the hopes that someone will find it and understand what's happening here. The creatures, they call themselves the Whispers. They've shown me things that I can't unsee, realities beyond our own, existing alongside ours, separated by the thinnest of veils. They say they need me, that I'm important somehow, but I don't know if I can trust them. All I know is that the forest isn't what we thought it was. It's alive in ways we never imagined, and it's hungry. If you're reading this, be careful out there. The shadows are deeper than you think, and what's lurking in them, well, let's just say it's not something you'll find in any guidebook. Remember, the silence is your first warning. When the forest goes quiet, that's when you know they're near. And if you hear that rasping breath, Run. Run, and don't look back. Because in the end, that's all any of us can do. Run, and hope that whatever's out there doesn't catch up to us. But deep down, I think we all know the truth. It's already here. It's been here all along. And it's only a matter of time before it decides to step out of the shadows and show itself to the rest of the world. God help us all when it does. The mountains have a way of calling to certain people. Not everyone hears it, but those who do can never ignore it. My name is Keenan Ashford, and I heard that call from the moment I first laid eyes on the rugged peaks of Shasta Trinity National Forest. Growing up in a small Oregon town where the biggest excitement was the annual Harvest Festival, I dreamed of something more, something wild and untamed. The ranger station that became my second home was a sturdy log building that had weathered decades of storms. It sat nestled against the tree line, a sentinel watching over the wilderness. The permanent smell of pine and coffee hung in the air, mixing with the scent of wet gear drying by the wood stove. I was 23, fresh out of training and eager to prove myself to the veteran rangers who'd made this their life's work. Mike Robertson and Ethan Chen became more than just colleagues in those early days. Mike was the veteran. 15 years on the job had left him with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to see straight through you. Every scar on his hands had a story, every gray hair earned in service to these mountains. Ethan was our technical expert, younger than Mike but with an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns and predict the mountain's moods. Together we formed a tight unit, each complementing the other's strengths. The story started during my first week. The old-timers would gather in the common room after their shifts, clutching cups of coffee or something stronger in worn hands. They'd talk about things they'd seen in the deep woods, their voices dropping to whispers as the tales grew stranger. They spoke of lights dancing through the fog when no aircraft were nearby, of sounds that couldn't come from any known animal, of hikers who vanished without a trace only to turn up miles away with no memory of what happened. I dismissed these stories at first, categorizing them with Bigfoot sightings and UFO reports. The forest was dangerous enough without adding supernatural elements to it. We dealt with real threats daily: hypothermia, falls, wildlife encounters, the unforgiving nature of the wilderness itself. These were the enemies I prepared to face, not shadowy creatures or unexplained phenomena. Clara Hobbs was different from our usual rescue cases. She wasn't some unprepared tourist who'd wandered off trail or an overconfident amateur who'd overestimated their abilities. She was an experienced mountaineer with over 100 successful climbs under her belt. Her gear was top-notch, her route plans meticulously detailed, and her check-in schedule religiously maintained. Until suddenly, it wasn't. When Clara missed her second check-in, something felt wrong. She was scheduled to summit Granite Peak, a challenging but straightforward climb she'd done several times before. The weather had been clear, the conditions ideal. Even Mike, usually the first to suggest rational explanations, seemed troubled by her silence. We mobilized at dawn, the morning air crisp enough to make our breath visible in the pale light. The gear we carried was familiar: ropes, first aid supplies, emergency rations. But something about this search felt different. The forest itself seemed quieter than usual, the normal morning chorus of birds conspicuously absent. Ethan took point, his eyes constantly scanning the ground for signs of passage. Mike brought up the rear, his experienced gaze watching our backs. The trail to Granite Peak started pleasantly enough, winding through old-growth forest where shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy like golden spears. But as we climbed higher, the vegetation changed. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead until only occasional glimpses of sky remained. By mid-afternoon, we'd reached the area where Clara should have made camp. The site was undisturbed. No tent marks, no fire pit, no sign she'd ever been there. We spread out to search the surrounding area, maintaining voice contact through periodic calls. The temperature began to drop as shadows lengthened across the mountainside. Making the decision to camp for the night wasn't easy. Protocol suggested we should return to base and resume at first light, but something in my gut told me we needed to stay. We set up a minimal camp, the three of us positioned in a triangle formation that would give us the best view of our surroundings. The night closed in like a living thing, bringing with it a silence so complete it made our ears ring. Even the normal nocturnal sounds, owls, small animals, the rustle of wind through leaves, were absent. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The first cry came just after midnight. At first it sounded almost human, a keening wail that could have been grief or pain or both. But there was something wrong about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, impossibly loud yet somehow distant. Ethan was the first to his feet, his headlamp cutting through the darkness. Mike already had his hand on his rifle, years of experience evident in his controlled movements. We moved toward the sound, our training overriding our instincts to run in the opposite direction. The clearing appeared suddenly, as if the forest had parted to reveal it. Moonlight filtered through breaks in the canopy, casting everything in an otherworldly silver glow. And there, in the center, was Clara. She knelt on the ground, her back to us, her shoulders shaking with what looked like sobs. The wrongness of the scene hit me immediately. Her clothes were pristine. No dirt, no tears, no signs of having spent days in the wilderness. Her hair was perfectly arranged, not a strand out of place. And when she turned at our approach, her face... The thing wearing Clara's face smiled at us, but the expression was all wrong, like something that had learned about smiling from looking at pictures. Her eyes were too wide, too bright, reflecting our lights like an animal's. When she spoke, her voice was layered with other sounds, rustling leaves, breaking branches, distant screams. That's when we saw what was standing behind her. The creature emerged from the shadows like it was made of them, its form seeming to shift and change as it moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin had a texture like bark, but seemed to ripple and flow like water. The head was elongated, almost deer-like, but where there should have been eyes, there were only deep, dark pits that seemed to draw in light. Mike reacted first, his training kicking in as he raised his rifle, but the creature moved with impossible speed. One moment it was behind Clara, the next it was directly in front of us. Its presence overwhelming. The smell hit us then, a mixture of rotting vegetation and something metallic like old blood. "Don't move," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just don't move." The creature's head tilted at an impossible angle, studying us with those bottomless pits that served as eyes. Clara, or whatever was wearing her form, began to change. Her features seemed to melt and reform, the perfect facade cracking to reveal something else underneath. Her movements became jerky, puppet-like, as if something else was pulling invisible strings. The attack came without warning. The creature lunged forward, its limbs elongating as it moved. I dove to the side, feeling the wind of its passage as massive claws sliced through the air where I had been standing. Mike opened fire, the sound deafening in the confined space of the clearing. The bullet seemed to pass through the creature, leaving ripples in its form like stones thrown into a pond. Ethan had pulled something from his pack, an old flare gun he always carried for emergencies. The red light burst across the clearing, illuminating the scene in crimson. For a split second, I saw the creature's true form in that harsh light, and my mind recoiled from what it witnessed. No words could adequately describe what we saw. It was as if reality itself had torn open to reveal something that should not exist in our world. The creature reacted to the light with a shriek that made my ears bleed. It recoiled, its form becoming less solid, more like smoke in the wind. The thing that had been pretending to be Clara dissolved into a black ichor that seeped into the ground, leaving only her real body behind, unconscious but breathing. We didn't wait to see if the creature would return. I scooped up Clara while Mike provided cover. Ethan led the way, another flare ready in his hand. The journey back down the mountain was a nightmare of stumbling through darkness, every shadow seeming to move, every sound a potential threat. Dawn was breaking when we finally reached the ranger station. Clara was immediately transported to the hospital, where she would spend weeks recovering. She had no memory of what happened after her first day on the mountain, and perhaps that was a mercy. The official report listed her as being found hypothermic and dehydrated, with no mention of what we'd encountered. Mike, Ethan, and I never spoke publicly about what we'd seen, but we made changes to our procedures. No more solo searches after dark, always carry flares, and most importantly, trust your instincts when they tell you something is wrong. Weeks later, when Clara was released from the hospital, she came to thank us. There was something different about her eyes now, a haunted look that I recognized from my own reflection. She didn't ask about what happened, and we didn't offer any explanations. Some truths are better left unspoken. I still work search and rescue in Shasta Trinity. The mountains haven't lost their beauty, but I see them differently now. I know that in the deep woods, in places where the shadows lie thick and the ancient trees stand watch, there are things that defy explanation. Things that hunt not just for food or territory, but for something else entirely. Mike retired last year, but Ethan and I continue the work. We've trained new team members, taught them the official procedures and the unofficial ones, the little superstitions and practices that might mean the difference between life and death in the deep woods. We carry extra flares, avoid certain areas after dark, and never ever ignore the silence when it falls too heavily in the forest. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights when the wind howls through the trees, I think I hear that otherworldly shriek again. On those nights, I stay close to the ranger station's lights, checking and rechecking the locks, because I know now that the old stories weren't just stories. The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and terrible, and some of them are still hunting. The mountains still call to people, and we'll still be here to help those who get lost in their vastness. But now we know to listen more carefully to the forest's warnings, to pay attention when the birds go quiet and the shadows move against the wind. Because out there, in the deep dark of Shasta Trinity, something is waiting, something that wears familiar faces and moves with impossible grace, something that reminds us that we are not the apex predators we think we are. And every time I look up at Granite Peak, I say a silent prayer of thanks that we made it out that night. Because I know that somewhere in those ancient woods, that creature is still there, still hunting, still waiting for the next group of unwary visitors to wander too far from the marked trails and well-lit places. The weight of my badge felt heavier than usual as I sat in my office that quiet Friday morning. Cedar Falls had been my home for all of my 43 years, and I'd served as its sheriff for the last decade. My name's Thomas Reed, and until that day, I thought I knew every dark corner of this town. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across my desk cluttered with paperwork, noise complaints, minor vandalism, the usual small-town affairs. Deputy Wilson brought me my third cup of coffee, strong and black, just as Mrs. Holloway's call came in. "Sheriff, Earl hasn't come home." Her voice trembled, unusual for a woman who'd weathered 30 years of Earl's stubborn ways. "He left for his morning hunt before dawn. He always comes back for lunch, always. Earl Holloway wasn't just another resident. He'd taught me to hunt when I was 12, showed me how to track deer through the densest parts of our forests. The man could navigate blindfolded through those woods. Something wasn't right." I assembled a search team. Myself, Deputy Samuels, and 2 local volunteers who knew the terrain. The eastern section near the old quarry was Earl's favorite hunting ground. The place had history, dark stories that the old-timers whispered about over their beers at Malone's bar. The air felt wrong as we started our search. Too still, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush. Nature herself seemed to be holding her breath. We found Earl's truck first, parked in his usual spot off the logging road. Everything was in order. Thermos half full of now cold coffee, sandwich wrapped in wax paper, his lucky compass on the dashboard. The ground told a different story. Boot prints led into the woods, normal at first, then erratic, as if Earl had started running. We followed the trail until we found his rifle, abandoned in a small clearing. The ground around it was torn up, leaves scattered in a chaotic pattern that spoke of violence. The weeks that followed Earl's death changed our town in ways I never thought possible. People started locking their doors at night, something that had been rare in Cedar Falls. Parents kept their children inside after dark. The woods that had once been our playground became a source of whispered fears. Dr. Bishop's autopsy report raised more questions than answers. The wounds on Earl's body showed signs of both animal and human characteristics, but matched no known predator. More disturbing were the strange marks found carved into his bones, intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate. "Look at this, Tom," Bishop said one night, showing me photographs under his microscope. "These markings, they're too precise to be random. Whatever did this wasn't just killing for food." I spent hours in the station's records room, digging through old files. Found reports dating back to the 1800s, similar disappearances, all near the quarry, all following the same pattern. Every 30 years, like clockwork. How had no one noticed this before? The federal agents arrived on a Tuesday. 3 of them led by a woman who introduced herself as Agent Morrison. They took over the basement of our station, set up equipment I'd never seen before. Said they were from a special division dealing with unusual wildlife incidents. But I caught them speaking in low voices about things that had nothing to do with wildlife. One night I overheard Morrison on the phone. "The patterns match those found in New Mexico. Yes, same signatures. No, containment isn't possible at this point. Too many witnesses." The disappearances continued. 3 hikers vanished near Rush Creek. We found their camping gear scattered across half an acre, the same strange markings carved into the trees around their campsite. The air smelled wrong, like ozone and decay. Local wildlife started behaving strangely. Deer moved in perfect unison, as if choreographed. Birds flew in impossible patterns. My dog Buck, who'd never shown fear of anything, refused to leave the house after sunset. I started having dreams, if you could call them that. Visions of vast underground chambers beneath the quarry, of things moving in the darkness. The dreams felt real, too real. I'd wake up with dirt under my fingernails, though I hadn't left my bed. Then came the incident at Malone's bar. It was a quiet Sunday night when old Jim burst in, soaked to the bone despite the clear weather. He was rambling about lights in the quarry, about something speaking to him without words. We thought he was drunk until he started convulsing. His eyes rolled back, and he spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, reciting coordinates in a language none of us recognized. Agent Morrison's team was there within minutes, though I hadn't called them. They took Jim away in a black van, said he was being transferred to a specialized facility. We never saw him again. The town council called an emergency meeting. People were scared, demanding answers I couldn't give. Mayor Thompson suggested evacuating the town. Agent Morrison vetoed that idea immediately. "Containment is our priority," she said. "No one leaves until we understand what we're dealing with." I cornered her after the meeting. "What aren't you telling us?" She studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Sheriff, what do you know about the original settlement of Cedar Falls?" I told her what everyone knew. Founded in 1847, built around the logging industry. But she shook her head. "There was something here before, The native tribes avoided this area, called it the place of changing forms. Their legends speak of beings that came from the stars, that made their home in the deep places beneath the earth. I wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't. The markings, the patterns, the way animals behaved, it all pointed to something beyond our understanding. That night, Deputy Samuels and I discovered a hidden entrance in the quarry. It looked ancient. The stone worked in ways that seemed impossible for the tools of any era. Against my better judgment, we went in. The tunnel descended at an impossible angle, twisting in ways that defied geometry. Our flashlight beams seemed to bend and distort. The air grew thick with that same wrong smell, ozone and decay. We found a chamber deep underground. The walls were covered in those same markings we'd found on Earl's bones, but these were moving, shifting like living things. In the center stood what looked like a machine, but it was like no technology I'd ever seen. It pulsed with an inner light that hurt to look at. Samuels reached out to touch it. I tried to stop him, but I was too late. The moment his fingers made contact, the chamber erupted with light. Samuel screamed, not in pain, but in what sounded like recognition. His eyes went wide, and he began speaking in that same strange language we'd heard from old Jim. What happened next is still hard to process. The chamber seemed to fold in on itself, reality bending like paper. I grabbed Samuels and ran, dragging him back through the tunnels as something pursued us, something that moved through the walls themselves. We made it out, but Samuels was changed. He could remember everything that happened, but he couldn't explain it in words we could understand. He drew diagrams, complex mathematical equations that Agent Morrison's team immediately confiscated. The next day, Morrison called me into her office. "What you saw down there is just the beginning," she said. "There are things in this world that operate on principles we're only beginning to understand. Things that have been here far longer than us." She offered me a choice: join her organization or have my memories of the incident erased. I chose to join. Someone needed to protect Cedar Falls, to understand what we were really dealing with. My first assignment with Morrison's organization started immediately. They called themselves the Bureau of Environmental and Geological Anomalies, or BEGA, though I suspected this was just a cover name. Their real purpose went far beyond studying unusual phenomena. The equipment they brought in transformed the station's basement into something resembling a research facility. Screens displayed readings I couldn't understand: electromagnetic frequencies, gravitational anomalies, radiation levels, all of them centered around the quarry. "The entrance you found isn't the only one," Morrison explained, showing me thermal imaging of the area. "There's an entire network of tunnels down there, all connected to similar chambers. We've identified at least 7 major nodes." The patterns were expanding. We found more markings carved into trees, rocks, even the foundations of buildings. They seemed to be forming a massive symbol, with Cedar Falls at its center. Local animals continued their strange behavior. Entire herds moving in geometric patterns, birds flying in formations that defied natural law. Then the dreams started affecting others. People reported shared visions, vast underground cities, beings of light and shadow, messages in languages that shouldn't exist. Children drew the same bizarre structures in art class, though they'd never seen them. Mrs. Holloway, still grieving Earl, became our most valuable witness. She started remembering things from 30 years ago when she was just a girl. Similar incidents had occurred then, but everyone had somehow forgotten. The town's collective memory had been altered. "They've been here all along," she told me one evening, her hands shaking as she clutched her coffee cup. "Watching us, studying us. Earl knew something. That's why they took him. He was getting too close to understanding." The investigation led us to old mining records. The quarry wasn't just a quarry. It had been an entrance to something much older. The original settlers hadn't chosen this location by chance. They'd been drawn here, influenced by forces they didn't understand. Deputy Samuel's condition worsened. The equations he wrote became more complex, filling entire walls. He spoke of geometries that couldn't exist in our dimension, of beings that lived between moments of time. Morrison's team recorded everything, but I could see the fear in their eyes. Whatever we were dealing with was beyond their experience, too. One night, monitoring equipment detected a massive surge of energy from the quarry. The sky above Cedar Falls lit up with aurora-like lights, though we were too far south for such phenomena. Animals fled the forest en masse: deer, bears, even insects, all moving away from the quarry in perfect unison. Morrison mobilized her team. "It's starting," was all she said. We entered the quarry complex with advanced gear, hazmat suits, radiation detectors, weapons that looked more like scientific instruments than guns. The tunnels had changed since my last visit. They seemed organic now, pulsing with an inner light that cast no shadows. The central chamber had transformed. The machine we'd found earlier had grown, spreading across the walls like a living thing. Symbols flowed across its surface like liquid metal, forming and reforming in endless patterns. That's when we heard it, a sound that existed not in our ears, but in our minds. A vast, ancient consciousness reaching out to make contact. Morrison's team had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have truly readied us for what came next. The beings revealed themselves not as monsters or aliens, but as something far more fundamental, entities that existed in the fabric of reality itself. They'd been here since before Earth formed, watching, waiting. Cedar Falls was just one of many observation points worldwide. Through Samuels, who seemed to function as a translator, they explained their purpose. They weren't invaders or explorers, but guardians of something far more precious, the very laws that governed our universe. The patterns, the markings, the strange phenomena, all were part of a vast mechanism for maintaining reality itself. But something had gone wrong. The mechanism was failing, and our world was starting to show the cracks. The deaths, the disappearances, these were just symptoms of a much larger problem. The beings communicated through Samuels for hours, revealing truths that shook our understanding of reality. They showed us visions of their work, an endless task of maintaining the boundaries between dimensions, preventing the collapse of what they called probability walls. Cedar Falls sat at a nexus point, a place where these walls were particularly thin. The quarry wasn't just a mine, it was a monitoring station built eons ago. The deaths hadn't been accidents or attacks, but failed attempts at communication. Earl, Jenny, Martin, they'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, their minds unable to handle direct contact. Morrison revealed that similar situations were unfolding across the globe. Strange phenomena in remote locations, unexplained disappearances, shared mass experiences, all symptoms of a deteriorating system. "The walls are breaking down," she explained, showing me readings from their equipment. "Reality itself is becoming unstable. What we're seeing here in Cedar Falls is just the beginning." Through Samuels, the beings explained their request. They needed human assistance to repair the mechanism. Our unique consciousness, our ability to perceive linear time, these were tools they couldn't replicate. But the price of helping would be high. The town gathered in the high school gymnasium that night. Morrison laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Volunteers would be needed, people willing to risk their sanity, maybe their lives, to help repair the mechanism. The alternative was the gradual breakdown of reality itself, starting here and spreading outward. Mrs. Holloway was the first to step forward. "Earl would have volunteered," she said simply. Others followed. The mayor, several of my deputies, ordinary citizens willing to risk everything to protect their world. I added my name to the list without hesitation. The procedure began at dawn. The volunteers were connected to the mechanism through technology that blended the alien and the familiar. Samuels guided us. his altered consciousness bridging the gap between our understanding and theirs. What followed defies description in human terms. We experienced existence on levels we were never meant to comprehend. I saw the universe as they saw it, a vast, intricate machine of interconnected probabilities. Time became meaningless, space bent and folded around us. Not everyone survived the experience. Mayor Thompson's mind couldn't handle the strain. He exists now in a state between consciousness and catatonia, cared for in a special facility. Others emerged changed, able to perceive things beyond normal human awareness. The repair took what felt like centuries and mere seconds simultaneously. When it was done, reality stabilized. The beings withdrew, their work complete, but their presence remains. The quarry is sealed now, monitored by BIGA agents who understand its true importance. Cedar Falls has changed. Those who participated in the repair carry the weight of what we experienced. We see the world differently now. Notice the subtle ways reality bends and flows. The townspeople who weren't directly involved sense it too. There's a reverence now for the mysteries that lurk beneath everyday life. Morrison's team maintains a permanent presence here, disguised as a geological research station. They watch for signs of deterioration, ready to act if the walls begin to weaken again. Samuel serves as their primary consultant, his altered consciousness a valuable tool in understanding the being's technology. Mrs. Holloway found a kind of peace, knowing that Earl's death had meaning beyond random tragedy. She leads a support group for families affected by the events, helping them cope with losses they can never fully explain to the outside world. As for me, I still serve as sheriff. The badge feels different now. I'm not just protecting people from ordinary dangers, but from truths they aren't ready to face. Some nights I walk to the quarry's edge and look out over Cedar Falls. I see the subtle patterns in the stars, the geometric perfection in the way shadows fall, and I understand that our world is both more terrifying and more wonderful than we ever imagined. The beings left us with a warning. This repair was temporary. In time, the walls will begin to weaken again. When that happens, they'll need us, not just Cedar Falls, but all of humanity, to be ready. We're part of something larger now, guardians of a reality we barely understand. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear something in the wind that sounds like distant machinery. I know now that it's the sound of the universe's gears turning, of probability walls flexing and holding. It's the sound of reality itself, maintained by forces beyond our comprehension, protected by sacrifices most will never know about. And if you're ever driving through Cedar Falls, and you notice something odd about the way shadows move, or how the birds fly in perfect formation, or how the quarry seems to hum with its own inner life, just keep driving. Some truths are better left undisturbed, some questions better left unasked. But know this, there are people here watching, protecting, maintaining the thin wall between what you think is real and what actually exists. We stand guard not just over a town, but over reality itself, and we'll be ready when the walls begin to weaken again. The gentle hum of my RV's engine filled the air as I navigated the winding country roads leading to Lake Laconic. Beside me, my loyal golden retriever Cooper sat with his head out the window, tongue lolling in the breeze. His excitement was infectious, and I found myself smiling despite the weight of looming deadlines and persistent writer's block that had driven me to seek this weekend getaway. As a freelance writer, I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The plan was simple. Just me, Cooper, and our trusty RV, heading out for a couple of days of peace and quiet by the lake. Little did I know that this seemingly innocent escape would turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. The concrete jungle of the city gradually gave way to rolling hills and dense forests as we drove deeper into the countryside. The tension in my shoulders began to ease as the familiar pressures of urban life faded into the rearview mirror. This was exactly what I needed, a chance to clear my head, and hopefully reignite my creative spark. As we approached Lake Laconic, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The lake itself was a perfect mirror, reflecting the vibrant colors above and the silhouettes of the surrounding pines. The sight was breathtaking, and for a moment, I forgot all about my writing woes and impending deadlines. I found a secluded spot to park the RV, about 50 yards from the shoreline. It was perfect, close enough to the water for easy access, but far enough back to give us some privacy. As I began setting up our campsite, I noticed an old pickup truck parked about 100 yards away, partially hidden by a cluster of trees. The truck looked like it had seen better days. Its once red paint was now a patchwork of rust and faded color, and the tires seemed to be slowly sinking into the soft earth. It struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Probably belonged to some old-timer who used the lake as his private fishing spot. With the RV parked and leveled, I set up my folding chair by the water's edge. Cooper sprawled out beside me, his tail thumping contentedly against the ground. I cracked open a cold beer from the cooler and took a long, satisfying swig. The stress of the city seemed to melt away with each passing moment. As darkness fell, I lit a small campfire and roasted some hot dogs for dinner. Cooper got his share too, of course. The night was quiet, almost unnaturally so. No crickets chirping, no frogs croaking, just the occasional pop and crackle from the fire. It should have been peaceful, but something about the silence made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around the area, partly to work off the hot dogs, and partly to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the lakeshore, with Cooper trotting along beside me. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Long shadows stretched across the ground, and the trees on the far side of the lake looked like dark sentinels standing guard. As we walked, I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints in the mud near the water's edge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail. It led away from the lake and towards the old pickup truck I'd noticed earlier. As we got closer, I saw a faint light coming from inside the truck's cab. My heart began to race. Someone was in there. I crept closer, trying to stay quiet. Cooper, sensing my tension, remained silent at my side. When I reached the truck, I peered through the cracked rear window. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man was hunched over in the back seat, surrounded by piles of ratty clothes and empty food cans. He was muttering to himself, his hands moving frantically as if searching for something. In the dim light of a battery-powered lantern, I could see that his clothes were torn and filthy, his hair a matted mess. I backed away slowly, not wanting to alert him to my presence. But as I turned to leave, I heard his mutterings more clearly. The words were still indistinct, but the tone sent shivers down my spine. It was a mix of fear and anger, punctuated by what sounded like quiet sobs. Cooper and I hurried back to the RV. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled down all the shades. My mind was racing. Who was that man? Why was he living in that old truck? Was he dangerous? I turned on the small TV, hoping the noise would drown out my thoughts and calm my nerves. Hours passed, and I found myself drifting off to sleep despite my unease. But just as I was about to succumb to exhaustion, a sound jolted me awake. A soft, hesitant knock on the RV door. My heart leaped into my throat. Cooper was instantly alert, his ears perked and a low growl rumbling in his chest. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I kept by the bed. It could serve as a weapon if needed, and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response came, just another knock, more insistent this time. "I said, who's there?" I repeated, louder now. Finally, a voice answered, weak, raspy, barely above a whisper. "Please, help me." I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. Everything in me screamed that this was a bad idea, that I should call the police or simply drive away. But something in that voice, the raw desperation, made me pause. Slowly, I cracked open the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. The man from the truck stood there, looking even more haggard up close. His eyes were wild, darting back and forth as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. "What do you want?" I asked, still not opening the door fully. "Please," he repeated, his voice shaking. "Someone's after me. He's going to kill me. I need help." I weighed my options quickly. We were miles from the nearest town, and cell reception out here was spotty at best. Even if I called the police, it could be hours before they arrived. And if this man was truly in danger, against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and opened the door. "Come in," I said, stepping back to let him enter. "But I'm warning you, any funny business and you're out. Got it?" He nodded frantically and stumbled inside. I directed him to sit at the small table while I fetched a bottle of water from the fridge. Cooper positioned himself between me and the stranger, his normally friendly demeanor replaced by watchful caution. "What's your name?" I asked as I handed him the water. He gulped it down before answering. "Martin. My name's Martin." "Okay, Martin. Tell me what's going on. Who's after you?" Martin's hands shook as he set down the empty bottle. "I was hiking through the forest a few days ago when I came across this old cabin. It was raining, so I thought I'd take shelter inside. I thought it was abandoned, but—" He trailed off, his eyes going distant. "But what?" I prompted. "There was someone living there. A man. He wasn't right in the head. When he found me, he went berserk, started screaming about trespassers and thieves. He had a knife." Martin's hand unconsciously went to his side, and I noticed a dark stain on his shirt that I hadn't seen before. "Did you go to the police?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of dread. Martin shook his head vehemently. "I tried, but he followed me. He knows these woods better than anyone. Every time I thought I'd lost him, he'd show up again. I've been running for days. When I saw your RV, I hoped—" Just then, a loud bang resonated through the RV, like something heavy hitting the side. Cooper erupted into furious barking, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "Stay here," I told Martin, grabbing my flashlight and the hunting knife I kept in a kitchen drawer. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The night air was cold, raising goosebumps on my skin. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to create moving shadows at the edge of my vision. I swept the flashlight beam across the clearing, seeing nothing out of place. I was about to head back inside when a low, menacing voice spoke from the darkness. "Where is he?" I spun around, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, a man, tall and powerfully built. His face was hidden in the shadow of a hood, but I could see the glint of moonlight on the blade of a knife in his hand. "Get out of here!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Leave us alone." The man took a step forward. "Give me the little rat, and I'll go. Otherwise—" He left the threat hanging in the air. I knew in that moment that there was no reasoning with this man. Whatever had happened between him and Martin, it had pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. I had to protect myself and the terrified man in my RV. I backed towards the door, keeping the flashlight trained on the intruder. Just as my hand found the handle, the man lunged forward with surprising speed. His knife slashed through the air where I had been standing a second before. Instinct took over. I swung the heavy flashlight with all my might, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. I used that precious moment to dive into the RV, slamming and locking the door behind me. "We need to get out of here now!" I yelled to Martin, who was cowering in the corner. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life just as the man outside began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. I threw the RV into drive and stomped on the gas. We lurched forward, tires spinning in the soft earth before finding purchase. The attackers' enraged shouts faded as we sped away from the campsite, deeper into the forest on the narrow access road. For what felt like hours, we drove through the night. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every bend in the road a potential ambush. Martin sat silently in the passenger seat, jumping at every noise. Cooper paced restlessly in the back, still on high alert. Finally, we emerged from the forest and found ourselves on a main road. I didn't slow down until I saw the lights of a small town in the distance. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the bright fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the darkness we'd just escaped. "Wait here," I told Martin. I went inside, explained the situation to the startled waitress, and used the phone to call 911. Within minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. I recounted the whole story to the officers, the footprints by the lake, the man in the truck, the attack at the RV. They took Martin into custody, assuring me they would get him the medical and psychological help he clearly needed. As I watched them drive away, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The ordeal was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly finished. The attacker's face, hidden by that hood, haunted my thoughts. He was still out there somewhere in those dark woods, waiting. I spent the rest of the night in the RV, parked under the bright lights of the diner. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Cooper stayed by my side, a constant, comforting presence. As the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, I made a decision. I couldn't go back to my normal life, not yet. The shadow of that night loomed too large. I needed time to process, to heal. I packed up the RV, made sure we had enough supplies, and set off down the highway. I had no destination in mind, just a need to keep moving, to put distance between myself and Lake Laconic. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, I could find peace again. But for now, all I could do was keep driving, keep fighting the memories, and hope that somewhere down this long road, I would find the solace I so desperately sought. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the world in warm, comforting colors, I allowed myself a small smile. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. This was going to make one hell of a story. As I drove away from Lake Laconic, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The adrenaline that had kept me going was starting to wear off, leaving me feeling drained and shaky. Cooper, sensing my unease, rested his head on my lap, offering silent comfort. I drove for hours, stopping only for gas and to let Cooper stretch his legs. At each stop, I scanned the area nervously, half expecting to see the hooded figure emerge from the shadows. The rational part of my brain knew I was being paranoid, but after what I'd been through, I couldn't help it. By late afternoon, exhaustion was setting in. I knew I needed to find a place to rest, but the thought of stopping filled me with dread. Eventually, I spotted a sign for a campground about 20 miles ahead. It wasn't ideal, but at least it would have other people around. The campground was a far cry from the secluded spot at Lake Laconic. RVs and tents dotted the area, and the sound of children playing and adults chatting filled the air. Under normal circumstances, I might have found it too crowded and noisy. Today, it was exactly what I needed. I parked the RV and went through the motions of setting up camp, my movements mechanical and sluggish. A few fellow campers waved hello, but I couldn't muster the energy to do more than nod in response. Once everything was set up, I collapsed onto the small bed in the RV, Cooper curling up beside me. Sleep came in fitful bursts, punctuated by vivid nightmares. In my dreams, I was back at Lake Laconic, running through endless dark woods, the hooded figure always just a step behind me. I woke up several times, heart racing, before finally giving up on sleep altogether. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running aimlessly. I needed to go back home, back to my routine. Maybe that would help me shake off this lingering fear. I packed up the RV and hit the road once more, this time with a clear destination in mind. The familiar sights of my neighborhood should have been comforting, but as I pulled into my driveway, I felt a strange sense of disconnect. Everything looked the same, yet I felt fundamentally changed by my experience. The next few days passed in a blur. I went through the motions of my daily life, walking Cooper, answering emails, trying to write, but my mind kept drifting back to that night. I jumped at every unexpected sound, and sleep remained elusive. A week after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to do some research. I spent hours online searching for any news about incidents near Lake Laconic. To my surprise, I found several reports of hikers going missing in the area over the past few years. Most were eventually found, often disoriented and dehydrated, with confused stories about being chased or followed. One report in particular caught my attention. A hiker had been found wandering along a highway, miles from where he'd last been seen. He spoke of an encounter with a man living in an old cabin deep in the woods. The description matched Martin's story almost exactly. My hands shook as I read the article. It wasn't just in my head. Something was really happening out there. But what? And why? I debated whether to contact the police again. But what would I tell them? That I'd read some articles online that seemed to confirm the ramblings of a man they'd already taken into custody. I could almost hear their dismissive responses. Instead, I threw myself into writing. I started crafting a novel based on my experience, changing names and locations, but keeping the core of the story intact. It was therapeutic in a way, allowing me to process what had happened while maintaining some distance from it. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the constant fear began to recede. I still had nightmares occasionally, but they became less frequent. I finished my novel, and, to my surprise, found an agent interested in representing it. As my book went through the publishing process, I received an unexpected call. It was from a detective in the area near Lake Laconic. He'd read an advance copy of my book and recognized similarities to some cold cases he'd been working on. At first, I was hesitant to speak with him. I'd finally started to move on, and I wasn't sure I wanted to dredge up those memories again. But as he spoke, describing the cases he'd been investigating, I realized I couldn't walk away. If there was any chance my experience could help solve these cases, I had to try. Over the next few months, I worked closely with the detective, going over every detail of that night. We pored over maps of the area, trying to pinpoint the location of the cabin Martin had mentioned. It was slow, often frustrating work, but I felt like I was finally doing something productive with my fear. As fall turned to winter, the detective called with news. They'd found a cabin deep in the woods that matched the description from my story and the other reports. It was abandoned when they found it, but there was evidence someone had been living there recently. They also found something else, a hidden room beneath the cabin floor, filled with maps, newspaper clippings, and detailed notes about the people who'd gone missing in the area. It was the lair of a predator who had been stalking the woods for years. The case was far from over, but it was a breakthrough. For the first time since that night at Lake Laconic, I felt a sense of closure beginning to form. The monster in the woods was no longer just a shadowy figure in my nightmares. He was real, and now he was being hunted. As I hung up the phone after talking with the detective, I looked out my window at the city street below. The world suddenly seemed a little less dark, a little more manageable. I knew the road ahead would still be challenging. There were still questions to be answered, a trial to face if they ever caught the man. But for the first time in months, I felt ready to face whatever came next. I sat down at my computer and opened a new document. I had a sequel to write, and this time, the story wouldn't just be about survival. It would be about justice, about shining a light into the darkest corners of the world and facing what we find there. As my fingers flew across the keyboard, I felt a familiar spark of creativity, stronger than it had been in years. The writer's block that had driven me to Lake Laconic in the first place was gone, replaced by an urgent need to tell this story. Not just my story, but the stories of all those who had encountered the shadow in the woods. Cooper lay at my feet, a constant reminder of the comfort and courage he'd provided throughout this ordeal. Outside, the city hummed with life, oblivious to the dark tale unfolding on my screen. But that was okay. Some stories need to be told even if they're hard to hear, and I was ready to be the one to tell it. As I wrote, I realized that this experience, as terrifying as it had been, had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. It had shown me the darkness that can lurk in the world, yes, but it had also shown me my own strength, my capacity for courage in the face of the unknown. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across my desk, but for once the encroaching darkness didn't fill me with dread. Instead, I felt a sense of purpose, of determination. Whatever lay ahead, I would face it head on, one word at a time. And so I wrote, my story unfolding on the screen, a beacon of truth in a world that sometimes seemed consumed by shadows. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a mission, a calling, and I was ready to answer it. Growing up in our small village about 30 minutes from the nearest city, I learned early on that not all unexplained phenomena are meant to frighten us. Sometimes the supernatural simply wishes to coexist, to share our spaces in ways that challenge our understanding of reality without threatening our sense of safety. This is the story of the entity that shared our home during my adolescent years, and in some ways still does. I was between 12 and 14 when I first began to truly acknowledge its presence. Though looking back, I suspect it had been there long before. Our village was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where generations of families lived in houses passed down through the years. Our house wasn't particularly old or remarkable, a typical two-story family home with wooden floors that creaked and windows that rattled in strong winds. But it had something extra, something that made it unique, an unseen resident that would become a peculiar constant in my teenage years. The presence never felt malevolent or threatening. Unlike the malicious spirits you read about in ghost stories or see in horror movies, this entity seemed more like a quietly mischievous roommate who simply happened to be invisible. It was less about terror and more about coexistence, though trying to explain this to my parents proved consistently futile. The signs of its presence were subtle at first, shadows that moved just at the edge of vision, like someone walking past a doorway when you're home alone. These weren't the dark, menacing shadows that horror stories warn about, but rather the kind you might mistake for a family member passing by, only to remember that you're alone in the house. The footsteps were perhaps the most intriguing manifestation. They had a distinctive character, not the heavy, threatening stomps of a malevolent presence, but rather the casual walking sounds of someone going about their daily routine. Sometimes they'd be upstairs when I was downstairs, or vice versa, creating a strange comfort in knowing I wasn't entirely alone, even when my parents were away. At first, I could rationalize some of the sounds. We had a pet rabbit, a sweet creature named Luna, who had a habit of exploring every corner of the house. Her little hops and movements explained away many mysterious noises, but after she passed away, many of those sounds continued. The footsteps remained, doors still closed on their own, and things still moved when no one was around to move them. The entity seemed to have a particular fondness for our kitchen. Food would disappear, especially snacks, though never in large quantities, just enough to notice. A packet of cookies might be missing one or two, or a bag of chips might seem lighter than it should be. My parents always blamed me for these disappearances, and no amount of denial on my part could convince them otherwise. "But I didn't eat them," I would protest, met with skeptical looks and sighs of disbelief. "Then who did?" my mother would ask. hands on her hips. The ghost? If only she knew how close to the truth she was. What fascinated me most was the entity's apparent ability to understand and respond to direct communication. I discovered this gradually, through a series of incidents that seemed too coordinated to be mere coincidence. The most memorable example involved my collection of figurines on my desk. I had various small figures arranged there, characters from video games, animals, and most importantly, 2 special rabbit figurines that served as memorials to my deceased pets. While all the figurines would occasionally shift positions, which I initially attributed to being bumped by computer cables or careless movements, the 2 rabbit figurines began moving in ways that couldn't be explained by accident. One evening, after finding them in yet another new position, I decided to address the entity directly. Standing in my room, feeling slightly foolish but somehow certain I needed to try, I spoke aloud. "You can move the other ones as much as you like, but these stay exactly as they are now, okay?" To my amazement, those 2 figurines have remained untouched ever since, though the others continue their occasional wandering. This selective response suggested not just awareness, but understanding and respect for emotional significance. The entity seemed to have different moods, or perhaps different levels of desire for interaction. Some days it would be particularly active, almost playful in its manifestations. I remember one afternoon after a particularly long and tiring day at school. I had just gotten home and was preparing something to eat in the kitchen when the activity upstairs began. It started with footsteps, clear, deliberate steps moving across the floor above. Then came the door slamming, not violent or aggressive, but distinct enough to make me think my parents had come home early. This cycle repeated several times, and each time I would yell upstairs, "Keep it down!" The noise would stop momentarily, almost as if the entity was acknowledging my request, only to resume a few minutes later. It felt less like harassment and more like a child trying to get attention, or perhaps just amusing itself while keeping me company. Over the years, I began to notice patterns in its behavior. It seemed more active on rainy days, as if the gray weather encouraged it to be more present. It was also more noticeable during times when I was alone in the house, though whether this was because it was actually more active then or simply because the house was quiet enough to notice it, I'm still not sure. The entity never touched or moved anything truly important. Money left on counters remained untouched. Important documents stayed in place. Even when it moved things, they were never damaged or hidden where they couldn't be found. It seemed to understand the difference between inconvenience and actual disruption. I developed a strange sort of relationship with it over time. When I would come home from school, I would sometimes greet the empty house, knowing it wasn't really empty. If something went missing, I would ask aloud for it to be returned, and often it would reappear in an obvious place within a day or 2. My attempts to discuss this with my parents were consistently met with skepticism and dismissal. They were practical people who believed in what they could see and touch. My mother would attribute the moving objects to my carelessness, the missing food to forgotten late-night snacking, and the sounds to the house settling or the wind. "You have too much imagination," my father would say, shaking his head. "Houses make noise. Things get misplaced. It's normal." But I knew it wasn't just normal house noises or forgetfulness. The presence had a personality, a pattern to its activities that spoke of consciousness rather than coincidence. It wasn't malevolent enough to be a demon, nor did it fit the traditional description of a ghost. It was simply there, a permanent house guest who had its own way of interacting with the world. As I grew older, the activity gradually decreased, though it never completely ceased. Now, years later, still living in the same house, the entity maintains a quieter presence. Things still occasionally move, food still sometimes disappears, and every now and then I'll hear those familiar footsteps upstairs. It's as if it's content to remind me periodically that it's still here, still sharing our space, still part of our household's unique dynamic. The decreased activity makes me wonder sometimes. Did the entity's energy diminish, or did it simply grow more comfortable with our coexistence, no longer feeling the need to make its presence so obvious? Or perhaps as I grew older, it recognized that I no longer needed the same level of interaction or reassurance about its presence. Looking back now, I realize how fortunate I was that my first significant encounter with the supernatural was with something so benign. While others might have been terrified by unexplained movements and sounds, I found comfort in them. The entity became a constant companion during my adolescent years, a presence that, while mysterious, never threatened or harmed. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I'll hear a door close upstairs or notice a shadow move in my peripheral vision, and I'll smile, knowing our unusual housemate is still with us. I've learned to appreciate this peculiar coexistence, this sharing of space with something that defies conventional explanation. The missing snacks continue to be blamed on me, the moving objects attributed to carelessness, and the sounds dismissed as house settling. My parents maintain their skepticism, and I've learned to accept that not everyone needs to acknowledge our house's extra resident for it to be real. What exactly is this entity? I still don't know. Perhaps it's the lingering energy of someone who once lived here, unable or unwilling to fully depart. Maybe it's something else entirely, a being that exists in the spaces between what we understand and what we don't. Or possibly it's a manifestation of something we don't yet have the vocabulary to describe. What I do know is that it's been a constant presence through my formative years, teaching me that not everything unexplainable is frightening, that sharing your space with the unknown doesn't have to be terrifying, and that sometimes the most interesting relationships are with those we can't see but somehow know are there. The village has grown over the years. New houses have been built, and families have come and gone. But our house remains unchanged in one significant way. It still has its extra resident, its unseen but ever-present guardian who moves things, borrows snacks, and occasionally reminds us that reality is more complex and interesting than we sometimes allow ourselves to believe. These days, when I hear young families in the village trading ghost stories or discussing local legends, I think about sharing my experience. But I keep it to myself, knowing that some things are better left as personal mysteries, shared only with those who might understand that not all unexplained phenomena need to be frightening, that sometimes the supernatural simply wishes to share our space, to exist alongside us in its own quiet way. As I write this, sitting at my desk where those two rabbit figurines still stand undisturbed among their more mobile companions, I can hear familiar footsteps upstairs. They're fainter now, more distant, but still recognizable. A reminder that some presences, while unseen, become as much a part of our lives as the visible world around us. And somehow, I know that as long as this house stands, as long as these walls continue to shelter the living, they will also shelter our unseen resident, our peculiar housemate who has chosen to share our space and in its own way become part of our family story. Sometimes I wonder if it reads over my shoulder as I write about it, if it appreciates being acknowledged, being remembered, being understood as something more than a source of fear or confusion. Perhaps that's all it ever wanted, not to frighten or disturb, but simply to be recognized as present, as real in its own way, as part of the fabric of our daily lives. The house creaks around me as I write these final thoughts, and a shadow moves just at the edge of my vision. I don't turn to look. I don't need to. After all these years, I know who it is, and I know it means no harm. It's just checking in, as it always has, as I suspect it always will. And in a world that often seems determined to explain away every mystery, to rationalize every unexplained occurrence, there's something comforting about sharing space with something that defies explanation, something that reminds us that perhaps not everything needs to be understood to be accepted. Some dates burn themselves into your memory. For me, it's the Friday before Halloween 3 years ago. The day I learned that not all monsters hide in storybooks, and some woods are better left unexplored. The morning hadn't started ominously. The weather was typical for late October in our area. Overcast, with a damp chill that seemed to seep into your bones. The kind of day where the sun never quite breaks through the clouds, creating a perpetual twilight that makes shadows deeper than they should be. My dad and I had been cycling in those woods for years. It was our thing, weekend rides through trails we knew as well as the halls of our own house. The forest stretched for miles, old growth trees creating a canopy so dense that even on bright days, the light struggled to reach the forest floor. We'd always loved that about it, the way it felt like entering another world. But that Friday was different. The moment our tires crossed from gravel path to dirt trail, something changed. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, carrying an unfamiliar metallic tang that reminded me of old pennies. The normal forest sounds, birds, small animals, wind in the leaves, seemed muffled, as if something was actively suppressing them. Looking back, I realized the woods had been trying to warn us. Every rustling bush, every darting shadow was a signal to turn back. But we were still operating under the comfortable assumption that we understood our world, that nothing truly dangerous could exist so close to home. The shadows were the first clear sign that something was wrong. They moved against the wind, flowing like liquid darkness between the trees. At first I tried to rationalize them, tricks of light, animals we couldn't quite see. But shadows don't move with purpose. Shadows don't track your movements. When my dad's bike cracked a branch, the sound was like a gunshot in the unnatural quiet. I nearly fell, my heart hammering against my ribs. We laughed it off, the nervous laughter of people trying to convince themselves everything is normal. That's when my dad stopped laughing mid-breath. I'll never forget the look that crossed his face. My dad was a former military man, someone who'd seen combat, who didn't scare easily. But in that moment, all the color drained from his face, and his eyes widened with a primal fear I'd never seen before. Following his gaze, I saw it. The creature stood partially concealed behind a massive oak tree, but even hunched over, it towered at least 8 feet tall. Its proportions were wrong, arms too long, torso too thin, legs bent at angles that defied anatomy. But it was the head that froze the breath in my lungs. Massive horns curved over its face like a grotesque crown, their surface marked with patterns that seemed to shift and change if you looked at them too long. Its eyes glowed with an internal red light, not reflecting light like an animal's eyes, but generating their own hellish illumination. The fur covering its body wasn't just dark, it seemed to absorb light, except for the pulsing yellow and orange striations that ran through it like toxic veins. The rational part of my brain tried to categorize it: bear, elk, some kind of deformed moose. But nothing in nature moves the way this thing moved. Nothing natural can make you feel like prey just by looking at you. Our instincts kicked in simultaneously. We turned our bikes so fast the tires threw up dirt. As we pedaled with desperate intensity, I could hear it moving through the woods parallel to us. It wasn't running. It was keeping pace with an almost casual ease, branches snapping under its weight, its breathing a wet guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then it was beside me, close enough that I could smell it. A sickly sweet odor of decay mixed with something metallic and wrong. Its head turned toward me with that impossible fluidity, and it spoke. The voice was like gravel being crushed, like earth being torn open. "This is not the last time we meet." The words weren't just sound. They seemed to bypass my ears and materialize directly in my brain. Then it was gone, vanishing into the underbrush with a speed that something that size shouldn't possess. That night, lying in my bed, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination. The stress of school, too many horror movies, an overactive imagination, anything to explain away what we'd seen. My dad hadn't spoken about it during the ride home or during dinner. but I noticed he'd locked all the doors and windows, something he'd never done before. The rock came through my window at exactly 3:33 a.m. I remember because I'd been staring at my digital clock, unable to sleep. The crash of breaking glass made me jump so violently I fell out of bed. The rock was ordinary looking, but the note tied to it was written on what looked like bark, the letters carved deep into the wood. Look out. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I approached the window. The creature stood at the edge of our property where our yard met the woods. It was fully upright now, its true height revealed. The moonlight seemed to bend around it, creating a dark halo effect that made it hard to focus on directly. Its grin is what haunts me most about that moment. The teeth weren't just sharp, they were wrong, too numerous, arranged in ways that no mouth should be able to contain. The blood on them looked fresh, glistening wetly in the moonlight. It held my gaze for what felt like hours, but must have been seconds, then melted backwards into the darkness, leaving only the afterimage of that terrible smile burned into my vision. Looking back, going camping 3 weeks later was monumentally stupid, but at 9 years old, bravado often overcomes common sense. Plus, I had convinced myself that having my friend with me somehow made me safer. My friend's dad helped us set up camp, seemingly unconcerned about leaving 2 9-year-olds alone in the woods. The day passed normally enough. We built a fire, made hot chocolate, told the usual campfire stories. As darkness fell, the woods began to feel different. The shadows between the trees seemed to pulse with a life of their own. When my friend suggested going for a walk, I agreed, partly to prove I wasn't scared. We hadn't gone far from camp when we heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly. They were coming toward us with a steady rhythm that suggested whatever was making them knew exactly where we were. We ran. The footsteps accelerated to match our pace, then exceed it. I looked back, something you should never do in horror movies, but fear overcomes logic. The creature was there, moving with that impossible fluid grace, its body seeming to flow between the trees rather than run through them. It recognized me. I saw it in those glowing red eyes, a flash of malicious intelligence, a predator recognizing returned prey. The scream it let out wasn't just sound, it was pure terror given voice, a sound that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the primitive part of the brain that remembers what it was like to be hunted. When my friend tripped, I didn't stop. I'm not proud of that moment, but fear doesn't leave room for heroics. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would collapse. Only when I cleared the tree line did I dare to stop. That night, unable to sleep, I watched the woods from my window. The creature emerged from the trees like a shadow taking solid form. It moved with that unnatural fluidity, sniffing the air in a way that reminded me of a wolf tracking prey. Then its head snapped up, those hellish eyes locking onto mine. "You," it said, the word carrying that same gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It cleared our garden wall in a single bound, moving with impossible speed. The sound of it climbing the wall of our house was like enormous insects scuttling across stone. When it reached my window, its face pressed against the glass, breath fogging the pane. The teeth seemed even more numerous than before, arranged in concentric circles within its mouth. The glass between us felt impossibly thin. Unable to break through, it dropped down. I heard our front door handle turning with agonizing slowness. The sound of its breathing grew closer, heavy footsteps on our stairs. I dove under my covers, a child's defense against monsters, but in that moment, even that thin barrier felt like protection. I could hear it in my room, smell that sickly sweet decay odor. The sound of its breathing seemed to come from all directions at once. Then, as dawn's first light began to creep over the horizon, it left, the sound of its retreat marking its passage back to the woods. 3 years passed. The memory remained vivid. But the fear had dulled enough that I convinced myself to enter the woods again. That was my mistake. The silence descended like a physical weight. All natural sound simply ceased, as if someone had pressed a universal mute button. Then came the voice, not the gravelly growl from before, but something worse. It was beautiful, soothing, the kind of voice you might hear in a dream. "Come out to play." The thing that stepped out in front of me was both familiar and newly horrifying. Its head was canine but grotesquely enlarged, horns curving down over a face that seemed to be constantly shifting between different nightmarish configurations. Its arms hung to its knees, rippling with muscles that moved in ways that muscles shouldn't. Most disturbing was how it spoke with that beautiful voice while its mouth remained closed, the words appearing directly in my mind. When its jaws finally did open, they opened far wider than any skull should allow, revealing that infinite array of circular teeth. Something else saved me that day, another creature that burst from the bushes and engaged with the monster. I didn't stay to watch the outcome. Adrenaline carried me out of those woods faster than I've ever moved before or since. I haven't seen it since then, but I know it's still out there. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear something moving in our garden. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of movement in the woods that doesn't match any natural animal. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I'll hear that beautiful voice calling, inviting me to come out and play. I don't know what it was, some ancient predator, a demon, something that exists in the spaces between what we understand and what we fear. What I do know is that it's patient, it can wait, and it remembers. The woods still stretch for miles behind our house. During the day they look normal enough, just trees and shadows and the usual forest sounds. But sometimes when the light hits them just right, I'll see something moving between the trunks, something tall and wrong, with glowing red eyes and too many teeth, waiting for someone foolish enough to venture too deep into its domain. I've never told this story publicly before. Part of me hopes that writing it down will somehow diminish its power over me. But another part knows better. Because even now, 3 years later, I sometimes wake up at 3:33 a.m. to find fresh scratches on my window, or new notes written on bark, or just the lingering scent of decay in the air. The creature was right. That first meeting wasn't our last. And somehow I know it won't be our final encounter either. Because some things, once they notice you, never really stop watching. They just wait for the right moment, calling with beautiful voices and wearing terrible grins, patient predators playing a game that spans years rather than moments. Keep your eyes open in the woods, day or night. And if you hear something calling with a voice too beautiful to be real, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because some things that hunt in the woods don't just want to kill you. They want to keep you, to play with you, to make you part of their eternal game of predator and prey. When I first started working as a park ranger in Sand Hollow Preserve, I never expected my life to be anything but quiet. The isolation drew me to the job. Long stretches of silence out in the middle of nowhere, far from people, far from stress. I've never been one to shy away from solitude. My family jokes that I was born to be a hermit, and truthfully, I never minded being alone. Sand Hollow wasn't the kind of park that drew tourists in droves. It was far too remote for that. Just miles of dry scrubland, rocky hills, and scattered ponds. The sort of place only serious hikers and occasional hunters ventured into. My days were simple. Patrol the trails, check on the occasional hiker, make sure nobody started fires or got lost. The preserve had its quirks. Certain areas where the wind made strange sounds through the rocks, places where compasses acted oddly. Local tribes had stories about the land, passed down through generations, warning about places that should be left alone. I didn't pay much attention to those tales at first. Science could explain most of it. Magnetic deposits affecting compasses, wind patterns creating unusual sounds. I was wrong. It started in late June. The summer heat had settled in early that year, baking the ground and driving most wildlife into the deeper parts of the preserve. Harold Jenkins, a 62-year-old experienced hiker and local, set out one morning to do a loop around the park. Just a couple of miles. He never returned. At first, we thought maybe he had a heart attack or fell, so we organized a search. I was out there for days combing the scrubland with volunteers, but we never found him. Not a trace. A couple of weeks later, 2 university researchers went missing. Same area, same circumstances. Their car was found parked by the entrance, but they had vanished. We combed through every inch of the preserve again, but no bodies, no signs of struggle, nothing. The local police got involved. They called in experts, helicopters, dogs, everything. But it was like these people had just been swallowed up by the earth. That's when things started changing in the preserve. The wildlife began acting strangely. Birds stopped singing in certain areas. Even the insects went quiet. I remember the day clearly when things started to go south. I was walking one of the more remote trails near Split Crag, a formation known for strange echoes and an eerie sense of quiet. It was late afternoon, and I was checking an older section of the trail that hadn't been used much since the disappearances. The feeling of being watched had been growing stronger all day. At first, I dismissed it as nerves. I hadn't been sleeping well since everything started. But as I approached a shallow ravine with dense brush on either side, I noticed something strange. A smell. Faint at first, but as I got closer, it became overpowering. Like something had died and been left out for days in the summer heat. I thought maybe I'd finally found some evidence of the missing hikers, so I followed the scent into the brush. That's when I saw it. The creature was like nothing I'd ever encountered in my years of working in the wilderness. At first glance, I thought it was a large wolf or maybe a bear, but the proportions were wrong. Too big, too muscular, with limbs twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Its fur was patchy, coarse, and blackened in spots like it had been burned. The worst part was the smell. Rotten, like decay mixed with something sulfuric. It was crouched over something, gnawing with such ferocity that it hadn't noticed my approach. I stepped back, but not quietly enough. The creature stopped, slowly turning toward me, its head jerking unnaturally, like it didn't have full control of its own body. Its face, if you could call it that, reminded me of a boar with a snout-like structure, but far more grotesque. Thick, matted fur surrounded it, except for patches where the skin was exposed and raw. I froze, my body locked up with primal fear. But as quickly as it had spotted me, the creature bolted, disappearing into the brush with unnatural speed. My eyes drifted to the ground where the creature had been feeding. The remains were human, at least what was left of them. They were scattered, shredded, unrecognizable except for fragments of a hiking boot and a torn backpack. I didn't need to get closer to know who it was. It had to be Harold Jenkins. The weeks following my first encounter were worse than the actual sighting. Every shadow held potential danger. Every sound made me jump. My fellow rangers noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I'd startle at small noises, how I refused to patrol certain areas alone, but I couldn't tell them what I'd seen. Who would believe me? The nightmares started soon after. In them, I'd be walking the trails again, but everything would be wrong. The trees would bend at impossible angles, reaching for me with twisted branches. That smell, that rotting sulfuric stench, would fill my nostrils until I could taste it. And always, I could hear it following me. Not just walking, but dragging itself through the underbrush, its breathing wet and ragged. I started documenting everything. Trail cameras disappeared within days of being set up. Animal tracks would suddenly stop, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. The wildlife changed too. The deer, usually abundant in the preserve, became scarce. We'd find their remains sometimes, not eaten, just torn apart like something was practicing. One evening, while checking the western trails, I found something that made my blood run cold. large, deep claw marks scored into a tree trunk, at least 8 feet off the ground. But it wasn't just the height that disturbed me. It was the pattern. 5 marks, parallel, too regularly spaced to be from any natural animal. And they were fresh, sap still oozing from the wounds in the bark. That's when I heard it, a sound I'd never forget. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something in between. It echoed across the preserve, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. The birds exploded from the trees, filling the darkening sky with their panicked flight. And then, silence. Complete, absolute silence. I knew I should leave. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I had to know. I had to find proof. My flashlight beam seemed weak against the growing darkness as I followed the trail deeper into the preserve. The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath visible in the beam of light. That's when I noticed the ground. It was covered in frost, in the middle of summer. The crack of a branch behind me made me spin around. Nothing. But when I turned back, I saw them. Footprints appearing in the frost. Not animal tracks, not human prints, but something wrong. They were appearing one by one, as if whatever made them was walking toward me, invisible. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The prints kept coming. Steady, deliberate. Then I heard it. That wet, ragged breathing right in front of me. Close enough to feel its warmth on my face. The stench was overwhelming. My flashlight flickered once, twice, and died. In that moment of darkness, I felt something brush against my shoulder. Coarse fur and raw, wet flesh. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through branches, stumbling over roots. Behind me, I could hear it pursuing, not running but moving in a horrible, scuttling way, like a spider the size of a bear. I broke through the tree line into a small clearing, the moon providing just enough light to see. That's when my foot caught on something soft. I fell hard, my hand landing in something wet and sticky. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I was lying next to what remained of one of the missing researchers. The body was fresh. A low growl made me look up. There it stood at the edge of the clearing, fully visible in the moonlight. It was bigger than I remembered, its body a patchwork of fur, scales, and exposed muscle. Its head was wrong. Parts of it seemed to shift and change as I watched, like it couldn't decide what form to take. But its eyes were the worst part. They were intelligent, aware. They held not just hunger, but malice. It rose up on its hind legs, towering at least 10 feet tall. Its front limbs ended not in paws, but in long, twisted fingers with black claws. As it opened its mouth, I saw row upon row of teeth, some human-like, others curved and sharp as razors. A long, dark tongue flicked out, tasting the air. I knew in that moment that this was what had been taking people. Not for food. The scattered, uneaten remains proved that. It took them because it enjoyed it. It was intelligent enough to hunt systematically, to learn, to plan. And now it had me exactly where it wanted me. The creature lunged forward with impossible speed. I rolled to the side, feeling the wind of its claws passing inches from my face. My hand found a fallen branch, and I swung it blindly, connecting with something solid. The impact sent shockwaves up my arm, but I heard the creature hiss in pain. In the moonlight, I could see a trail leading down toward the ranger station. If I could just make it there. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my lungs burning with each breath. The creature's footfalls behind me were getting closer, each impact shaking the ground. I reached the steep incline leading down to the station and did something desperate. I jumped. The slope was almost vertical, covered in loose rocks and dirt. I half ran, half fell down it, knowing one wrong step would mean death. Behind me, I heard the creature's frustrated roar as it was forced to find another way down. The station's lights were visible now, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I fumbled for my radio as I ran. "Station, this is Hunt. Emergency at Sector 7. I need backup now." Static was my only response. I reached the station's door, yanked it open, and slammed it shut behind me. For a moment I thought I was safe. Then I heard it. That wet, ragged breathing, coming from inside the station. The power went out, plunging everything into darkness. My flashlight was gone, lost during the chase. The emergency lights should have kicked in, but they didn't. In the darkness, I could hear it moving, its claws clicking on the wooden floor. It was between me and the weapons locker, between me and any chance of survival. I moved as quietly as I could, trying to remember the layout of the station. Each step was agony, not knowing if I was moving toward safety or directly into its path. The smell was overwhelming now, filling the small space. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have killed me already, but it was enjoying my fear. A sound from behind made me turn. In the faint moonlight coming through the windows, I saw it crouched in the doorway to the communications room. Its body seemed larger in the confined space, almost filling the doorframe. Those intelligent eyes fixed on me, and I swear I saw it smile. That's when I remembered. The flare gun. Every station kept one by the front desk for emergencies. If I could reach it. The creature must have read something in my posture, because it suddenly lunged forward. I dove for the desk, my hand finding the drawer handle. The impact came from behind, sending me sprawling. Hot breath on my neck, claws digging into my back. In desperation, I kicked backward, connecting with something solid. The pressure lessened just enough for me to roll away. My hand found the flare gun. I turned and fired in one motion. The red flare illuminated the station in hellish light, catching the creature directly in its face. The shriek it let out was deafening, part animal scream, part human cry of pain. It thrashed wildly, knocking over furniture, its head aflame. I scrambled away as it crashed through the station, blind and burning. It smashed through a window, disappearing into the night. Its screams echoed through the preserve, growing fainter with distance. The backup generator finally kicked in, flooding the station with light. I sat there shaking for what felt like hours. When dawn came, we found a trail of blood and burned fur leading deep into the preserve. The creature had fled into a network of caves that honeycombed the northern cliffs. A team was assembled, experienced hunters, rangers, and wildlife experts. We tracked it to its lair. What we found there? The cave walls were covered with claw marks, some old enough to be almost worn away. Bones littered the floor, human and animal alike. Some showed signs of having been arranged in bizarre patterns, like some twisted form of art. The creature itself was gone, having retreated deeper into the cave system than we could safely follow. But we found something else. Journals, dozens of them, taken from its victims. Reading them revealed a pattern. The creature had been there for years, perhaps decades, slowly becoming bolder, more methodical in its hunting. We sealed the caves, officially declaring them structurally unsafe. Warning signs were posted, and the trails in that area were permanently closed. The official report cited mountain lion attacks for the deaths, with the cave collapse explaining why no further incidents occurred. But I know the truth. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind blows from the north, I can still hear it. A distant cry, not quite animal, not quite human. The caves weren't a perfect seal, and deep underground something waits. I still work at Sand Hollow. Someone has to keep watch to make sure no one gets too close to those caves, to make sure what lives in there stays there. The nightmares haven't stopped, but they've changed. Now I dream of those caves, of what might be down there, growing stronger, more intelligent, waiting for its chance to emerge again. Every missing hiker report, every strange animal sighting sets me on edge, because I know it's just a matter of time. The thing about intelligent predators is that they learn from their mistakes, and somewhere in those caves, something is learning, adapting, planning. I've started keeping my own journal, documenting everything I know about the creature. If something happens to me, someone needs to know what they're dealing with. The years have taught me that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that live in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. But for now, Sand Hollow is quiet. The tourists have started coming back. The missing persons cases have been filed away, and life has returned to normal, or what passes for normal in a place like this. I still patrol the trails, check on hikers, and make sure no one starts fires or gets lost. Only now, I carry extra flares, and I never patrol at night. And if you ever find yourself in Sand Hollow, stay on the marked trails. If you smell something rotten like decay mixed with sulfur, run. Run as fast as you can. Don't look back. Don't try to see what's following you. Just run. Because out there in the darkness of the caves, something is waiting. And it remembers. It learns. It hunts. And someday it will return.